Okay, thanks.
Any Apple engineers in the audience? All right, so after this nice entertainment, hello, and thanks for staying, and welcome to this presentation. My name is Jerome Gaillard, and I'm a software engineer at Google London, working on Android Studio design tools, and this is my colleague, Vadim Caen. And we're here, let's see if I can, yay! We're here today because this is something that we hear too often, in our opinion, which is that some of you prefer to write the layout by hands. And by that we mean just going to the XML and writing everything. And that is something that we understand the reasons for, but we want to try and convince you that in today's world and with the latest versions of Android Studio, there is definite benefit to also using the layout editor. So in particular, if you decided to use the constraint layout, and if you haven't decided to switch to constraint layout, stay tuned for the next talk, then you should definitely use the layout editor, because the two were really built together, and they really work well together. And really, if you want to use constraint layout, the layout editor will definitely be your best friend in doing so. There are other reasons you might have decided to switch to stay in XML, which is that once upon a time we were not doing a very good job at keeping your XML clean when we were just generating code for you through the layout editor. So for example, we used just to write randomly the attributes at the end of your file, which is not a great thing to do, especially if you work in teams and you do code reviews and you try to keep everything with some form of order. But I'm happy to say that nowadays we are sorting all the attributes for you. Maybe. Yes, no, it's a bit laggy. Yep. So we're sorting all the attributes alphabetically for you, which is a pretty good way of organizing things because of the namespace. So you probably, in any case, want to keep all the namespaced attributes together, and so that's what we're doing for you. And we're also removing obsolete attributes in doing so. Yes. So now, and to present more features of the layout editor and why we think you should use it, I'm going to pass it on to Vadim, that's going to show to you how to build some layouts.
Thanks. So the idea with this talk was to take some existing layout, so we use the player app here, and to find how to build this layout using the layout editor and some tools that are around it. So we're going to talk about the design asset wizard. We're going to talk about design time attributes or sample data that was announced last year at Google I/O, and other constraint layout feature, but we're going to go cover just the shallow part of it. So I just want to be sure that we're all on the same page with the layout editor. So you might be familiar with it, but we just take a tour of it to name every part of it. So the main area here is the design surface, which is composed of two main areas. On the right part, we have the design view or preview, which is the one you might be using the most. On the left side, you have the blueprint view. And on the blueprint view, some of you might not know when to use it. And this is kind of a nice view just to focus on your constraint and the bounds of your component without being distracted by any graphic in the preview. Then on the left side, we have the attribute panel, which is the way to edit your XML attribute. So by default, we are showing you this view, which is the attribute we think are most suited for you at most of the time. But you will, and you might want, and you will use the view all view, which will show any attribute, all the attributes available for your selected component. And you have a nice search bar, but we're going to go a little more on the property panel right after. Then we have the palette, which is a simple component that allows you to see your component, that's the available view from the framework, from the library. So you have some component from the support library available in the palette. But it also will show you the custom view that you might have in your project. So if you have like a lot of custom view, feel free to search from the palette, because there is also a search bar here. And it's kind of convenient to use it for custom view and other library view. Then we have the component tree. And I think it's like, so it's kind of a simple component, but quite powerful, because it's a mirror of your XML. And being a mirror of your XML means that first you can just reorder your XML really quickly by drag and dropping component. Especially if you have a deep hierarchy, then you can easily reorder component within your hierarchy. But it's also a way to tell like the order of painting for your component, because the topmost will be drawn first, and the last one will be drawn later, so they will cover the first one. And in constraint layout, for example, or frame layout, those components might overlap, so you might want to use a component tree just to reorder them. And finally, we have the issue panel, which show you the lint error that you would see in XML and the quick fix that goes with it. So if you have a button with a static string in it, you can use the quick fix button to just extract the string and put it in your resource file. But it will also show you the rendering error. And I can see a lot of people wondering why their layout doesn't render in the layout editor. And there is often some nice hint within the error panel which going to tell you why your layout doesn't render. It might be because you didn't do a Gradle sync before. You might be referencing a library that you didn't import it, or maybe it's just like it's a wrong way of, you might are using a custom view and the path is wrong or whatever. So here it is for our tour, and we're gonna start to implement just the player control first. So when you start building the player control, you will drag and drop a button from the palette. You will remove the background and remove the text, and we end up with this button. And that's not what we want to have, right? It's a weirdly shaped button. We want to make it square. So there is two ways to make it square. You can, you can either just use a fixed size, or you can use constraint. Yeah, because constraint layout is powerful for two reasons. So you can apply constraint for the position of your component, but also for the size of your component. So by using the button in the constraint widget within the attribute panel, you are able to switch between fixed size, wrap content, or match constraint. And whenever you have a match constraint set for any of your dimension, you can start using the aspect ratio button, which is kind of hidden, but it's there, and define your own aspect ratio. So here we have a 1:1 aspect ratio, but nothing prevents you in your image, here it's a wrap content for now, to use another ratio, so 1:1, 1:2, 3:1. And a feature that I really like is when you set both of your constraints as match constraint, then you can play with the margins, and then you can create some nice animation with it, or you can make some nice responsive layouts using this aspect ratio feature. All right, so we have our button. We still need to put the rest of our buttons. And what you would do in a typical layout is to use linear layout right here with some margins. But when you are using constraint layout and you think about linear layout, what you should think about is chains. So chains is a really nice feature and powerful, which is even more, even more customizable than linear layout. So here we see our chain with the different constraints that are going to be applied to it. So how do we create our chain? Oh, sorry. Yeah, here it is. So from our previous button, what we can do is just copy-paste it a few times until we have the correct number of buttons, which is actually false because I have 6 buttons and there is 5 in the player control. But anyway, you right-click then on the component tree, and you can go through your helper method and create your chain. And can you just imagine how long it would have taken to do that with XML? You would have to write the constraint for every button. So like button 1 to left on button 2, and etc. And with only one click with the layout editor, you have your chain created. So just a little more about chains. I won't cover everything here. So there's different kind of chains. Spread is the one we just used. So it's going to spread evenly your component between the two constraints. Then you have packed, which is going to pack together the constraint. And in all cases, the margins are respected. And finally, there is spread inside, which is a concept a little, it's very similar to spread, but there is a slight difference, which is, I had a hard time to understand at first, is that it's going to first place your external component to the constraint, and then distribute evenly the other component inside those two components that are already constrained. And finally, about constraint layout, there is a bias. And once again, here, the layout editor is quite convenient to edit bias because we have a nice slider that will, so you can have a nice preview of what you're doing. You don't have to edit manually and erase the bias you want to add. And what is bias? It's a way to say to constraint layout toward which constraint you want your component to be laid out. And this works for a packet of chain, like here, or it can work also for a single view. So we still need to add some more color to our layout. So Jerome, I'm going to continue on how to get the icon.
So now that we have our...
Nope.
Hello. Yep. We need to work on our transitions. Now that we have our nice bar of buttons, you might notice that they're all play buttons, which is not what we want to do. And so in order to create the other icons, you can either rely on somebody to give you a file, a PNG file maybe for that icon. But if you don't have that luxury and you're not very good at making those yourself, you might want to rely on a tool inside Studio called a vector asset, which is accessible through the drawable right-click, new vector asset. And then here, you can either import an SVG file if you want to use a vector drawable that you already have, or we provide a very long list of pretty much all possible icons for all possible use cases, which you can access through the clip art button here. And here I already selected the one that I'm interested in, but they're classified by category, and there's also a nice search bar for it, but there is pretty much icons for whatever you want. And once you found the one you want, you might want to edit some of its properties. Here you can change the color, for example, the size, the opacity of your icon. And if you decide, in any case, that you're happy with it right now, but you might want to change it later, you can always edit it in the XML file that it's going to create later. And here it nicely tells you that it's going to put your new icon in your drawable folder. And here you have it. And what this tool just did is basically create a vector drawable for you, which is really what you want, because then you don't need to provide density-dependent icons for different densities. And the good thing about it is that if you open that XML file, as I did, here you can see that not only you have the actual XML code for the vector drawable, you also have a nice preview of that drawable. And if you were to make any modification in the XML file, you would see them directly applying on the preview. So that's quite useful if you want to edit those vector drawable, or just if you wonder what those are, you can easily see it. And now that we have our icon, what we want, obviously, is to assign it to our button. And we're going to do that through the attributes panel. So you might already know about this panel, which is to the right of your layout editor. So if you click on the button you want to edit and open the attributes panel, you will see that there is a selection of all the possible attributes that exist for that component. And this selection is what we think are the most likely attributes that you might want to edit. That might not be all the attributes that you might want to edit, and I'm going to show you in a minute how to edit the rest. But here we want to edit the background, which is one of the ones that are available readily in the first window of the attributes panel. And if you already know the name of your icon file, that because, for example, you've just created it, you can just start typing it here and use autocomplete as is currently showing. But maybe it's been a while and you don't remember the name of your file, or maybe you don't really know what icon to use. And so for that, there is those 3 dots that you can click on, and that opens the resource picker. So that resource picker is showing you all the possible resources that would be valid resource for that attribute. So here, because it's a background, it's going to show me various resources, colors and drawables. And we show you the ones that are available in your project, both because you've added them yourself to your project, and also the ones that are provided by the Android platform. So you can browse all your resources, looking for the one you want. And here I find it, and voila, that button is now a skip forward button. But you might want to edit more attribute, as I said, of your button, and let's say you wanted to make that icon a little bit transparent. You want to edit the alpha value, but it's not one of the most common attributes that we think you might be interested in, so we didn't put it in the first view of the attributes panel. But as Vadim mentioned earlier, there is an easy way to reach them. You can click on the View All Attributes at the bottom, or that 2-arrow button at the top of the attributes panel, and you will see a list of all the attributes that exist for that particular view. And because it's a very long list, we provided a search bar for it. And you can see that as soon as I put 0.4 in the alpha field, my button becomes slightly transparent. You might have noticed while I was editing that button that there is this weird brush icon next to it. And that's something we will come back into more details later, but I can tell you already right now that it is to make that attribute a tools attribute. You're probably already familiar if you created layouts before about tools attribute, and those attributes are design time attributes, which means that they will only affect the way your layout renders in the layout editor, but will not affect how your layout renders at runtime, and that's to help you design your app. All right, so now we jump ahead a little bit. We've done all our icons, but we see that we have apparently some errors in this layout. And you can see that with the many red icons in the component tree. If you want to know more about those icons and the error associated with them, you can click on it directly, or if you press the E key, it's the shortcut to open the issue panel. It's E for issue, I know. Once you open the issue panel, you can see what the problem is with your layout. And here, what we notice is that we are missing vertical constraints. And indeed, when we created the change, we only created horizontal constraints, saying like, oh, you need to spread your buttons in the horizontal direction, but it hasn't told the constraint layout where to put them vertically. And obviously, what we'd like is for them to all be aligned vertically. So one thing you could do is go to your XML file and for each button say, align the top of this button with the top of the next button and align the bottom with the bottom of the next button. But that seems very tedious and also quite error-prone. So instead, we provided for you some quick helpers that you can see appear once you select a group of views. So here, if I select all the views buttons for my control bar, I can see that there are some menus that appear at the top, and we can explore a little bit what's in those menus, and we have very many different kinds of things that you might want to do. And here what we want to do is vertically center all those buttons. So that's what we're going to do. And once we've done that, you can see the constraint appear in the design surface, and that means that now all our buttons will be aligned together vertically, which means they always will be at the same height. And you might have noticed in the component tree that there is still one error left. And that is because now each component knows that it's supposed to align itself vertically relative to the others, but nobody knows where it should be in absolute, so the toolbar itself doesn't know its vertical position. But that's fine here, because obviously we want to include that into a bigger view, and that's then that we're going to specify the vertical constraint for that toolbar. And speaking of bigger views, jump ahead a little bit into a more complete layout. And we see that we have now our toolbar, and we put the right constraint, so there is no error anymore. But if you look at the component tree, there are very many components in that layout. And you wanted to keep it flat, which is something that we like. But maybe you want to organize it a little bit. Or maybe you want to reuse a subpart of that layout into some other layout later on. For example, that first toolbar at the top of your layout. So that's very easy to do. You can just, in your component tree, select all the layouts that you want to, all the views that you want to kind of extract as a layout on their own. And then once you've done that, you can just do refactor extract layout, give it a name, and here it is. So now, it seems like not much has changed, but if you look in the component tree, now instead of having all the individual components, here you just have a view of just that toolbar, but viewed as part of the bigger layout. And you can easily navigate between the layout just about the top toolbar when you're editing it and the bigger layout by either clicking on the include tag in the component tree or clicking on the back arrow in the smaller layout to go back to the overall layout. All right, so as I was mentioning earlier, I said we would come back to tools attributes, and Vadim is going to talk to you more about that.
Right, thanks. So design time attributes are kind of a very powerful tool when you're editing layout. So you might all have heard about tools attributes. So tools attribute is our way in XML to add annotation. So when you have a lint error in Java and you want to ignore it, you might just add an annotation. So what you would do in XML is to add this tool attribute for here. For example, we don't want to translate this whole string to Italian. So what we do is just adding the tools missing translation, ignore missing translation attribute to our XML file. So design time attributes are kind of a subset of those tool attributes, but for the layout editor. So here, for example, we have this constraint layout that's going to be included later in another bigger layout. So we just see the control, but we don't see the context of where it's going to be used. So that's what it's for. The design time attributes are here to provide context for the layout editor about how and where you're going to use your layouts. So here we want to see our control in context of the including view. So what we do is that we add the show in attribute with the including layout. So with here, activity main, the layout activity main is the one including our layout here. So we just add the show in, and then it appears like this. And you can still continue to edit your layout, I mean, just the included part as you were doing before, but at least you can see what's around. And another way to provide context, and this is more for an XML lover, it's to provide context about where your view will be used in the code. So here we have a button, and we've set the onClick attribute with onClick button. But no, our onClick button handler is not set anywhere, right? So what you might do is just go into your Java file and create your handler, your listener. But IntelliJ provides a lot of refactor option, and so we plug the Android Studio on this system to add some action for layouts. So in that case here, our button will be used in the main activity class. So you can add the context tools attribute and say that it's going to be used in main activity. And now your on-click button is underlined, so you can click Alt-Enter, and we will provide you with a nice pop-up saying, prompting you if you want to create your listener. So here again, like just adding one attribute and one click, your listener is going to be created. Another way to provide context also is within fragment. So if you're using fragment and multiple fragment in a view, like here, what you would end up here within the layout editor is this boring gray bar that doesn't provide much information about what your layout is. So if you, maybe it's fine if you're just editing your layout and you're gonna use the fragment right now. But if you come back 6 months later, or if your colleagues see this view, they won't know directly just by looking at it what those fragments are. So what you can do here is add the tools layout attribute for your fragment and say which layout is going to be populated at runtime. And by providing that, we have some nice preview in the layout editor. So you will save some time to yourself, to your future self, and your teammates. So design time attributes are great, so to disable lint warning and provide context, but you can go even further with the recently added sample data. And Jerome will come back to talk about all you can do and all that has been added for sample data.
So tools attribute can replace any attribute in your, that you might use in your views. So you're probably already familiar with the very simple use case of maybe providing some text at design time for a text view that you don't want to appear at runtime, but maybe your text view will set its text dynamically or change the text, and you just want to see how some text would look like in your layout without hard coding it in your app. So what you can simply do is use tools.text instead of android.text in your text view, and you now see that in the layout editor, your text view will have the text song title, but that attribute will be stripped at compilation, so when you're running it, that will have no impact. Something that you're probably also familiar with, and that might be one of the reasons you stopped using the layout editor, is how recycler views look by default when you add them in the layout editor. So on your left is a layout with a recycler view in it, and by default it shows this very interesting list of 10 items, items 0 to 9. We've been very creative. And what you probably want it to look, and what your app will look like, is what's on the right, which is a list of actual layouts with text and images that are different. And what's on the left is pretty useless to you when designing your layout, and what's on the right is much more interesting. And so we're going to tell you how to transform what's on the left to what's on the right. So first of all, well, the problem is that usually the way to use recycler views is to provide data dynamically. So that's why the layout editor cannot by itself figure out what data it's supposed to render when displaying, but also that makes it hard for you to obviously design your recycler view and the layouts inside them, but also, for example, to figure out what the impact of internationalization might be, having longer strings, shorter strings, left to right, right to left, that kind of issues. So you might already be familiar with those tools attributes, list item and item count. They've been around for a while, and they've provided a very simple way of customizing your recycler view in the layout editor by just providing with list item the layout of the item to display, and with item count the number of items to display. So that way you can play with what it would look like to have a long list or a short list, and you can see what probably your real layout that you would want to put in your recycler view will look like. But that's still a bit boring because all the items that way are the same. And that's not what your app would look like, so that doesn't really tell you, give you much of an idea of what your app would eventually look like. So that's where sample data comes in. So that's a feature we've added in Android Studio 3.0, so hopefully you've all used that and you're using 3.1 anyway, probably 3.2 Canary, so everybody should have access to sample data. And the way to create it is very easy. There is a new sample data directory, and then you just simply add files of sample data to that directory. Here we create a materials colors file, and in that file we just write a list of colors. And what we're going to do is use those colors in our recycler view. And how we do that is that inside the item layout, we're going to change the color or tint of the musical note by using the tool's tint attribute. But instead of giving it an actual value, which would mean that then all of the musical note would then have that new value, we're going to use the sample data, and it's used in the same way that you use every other resource. So here the code word for it is add sample, and then the name of your file. So here you use add sample material colors, which means that the image view will use for the color of the musical note now one of the colors in that file that you provided, and the recycler view will just choose a different color for every item. So now you see that all 5 items have different colors that are all coming from that file that you provided. And we can do much more with sample data. We can also do text. So now, in the same way, instead of writing a file with a list of colors, you can write a file with a list of strings in it. Here we called it song titles. And if you use that in your text view as a tool's text attribute, then the text view will use, again, every time a different song title. And if you don't want to bother writing your own sample data file, we provide predefined ones. Names is one of them. So the syntax is a little bit different to use the ones that are provided in the same way you would say like @Android : for like an Android attribute. Here it's @tools : sample for choosing one of the predefined one. And there's one called full names that are like first names and last names. And you can use that as well in your text view. In addition to names, there are more sorts of text that we provide. We provide a list of cities, some lorem ipsum text that you can also decide to parameterize with a given number of words. So if you like put like /lorem and then in bracket the number of words that you want to use, it will use always that fixed number of words. And there are also images, not just text. So for example, the avatars one will be a set of avatar images. And if you wanted to use images yourself, it's very easy to provide. So instead of writing a file of sample data, now you just create a new directory in your sample data folder. So here I have a directory called covers, and inside that directory, I added a whole bunch of images. And now, if I use covers as the name of the sample data resource, so if, let's say, in a tools like image source attribute, I can use @sample/covers, and then it pick a different image every time. And this is what I did here. In my image view, I used for the source, in the tools attribute, I use @sample/covers, and now it should use a different image every time. But here, it's not looking quite right. And instead of looking like a list of attributes, it just looks like a big picture. And you quickly realize that I forgot to define the height and width of my image view, and so the image took too much space. And that's something that we very quickly realized at design time while building the layout. Caught that error very quickly, easily solved, while if you had just had to compile your app, run it on the emulator or on device to debug your layout, first to realize that there was a problem with your layout, then figure what the problem was, debug it, that would probably have been much more painful. One last data format that's possible for sample data is JSON file. So that's very practical. For example, if you have a JSON API, if you're using JSON API with your app, you can simply just make a call, copy your the response as a JSON file and just put it in your sample data directory. You can also just write your own JSON file in your sample data directory. That could be a way for you to organize your sample data if you want always kind of like a title to correspond to an author while you're designing, for example. And that's very easy to use in the same format as for the standard files. Here you just use @sample/ the name of your file, .json, / the element you want to use. So in the first text view, we want to use the title, and in the second text view, the author, and the layout editor will understand that for a given item, it should use the title and the author coming from the same line. So yeah, you saw that sample data makes it way more powerful to use the layout editor for designing layouts that will really look like what you're going to see at the end. But one thing that might still bother you when using the layout editor is when you're using custom component, nothing renders. And Vadim is going to tell you a bit more about how to fix that.
Yeah, so custom component, it's a hard case, right? It's, you're building your component and you cannot see it in the layout editor, and this is quite frustrating. You don't want to see this ugly, again, gray view. And there is a way to prevent that. And so there is several reasons why you don't want to see that. First, it's more beautiful. You can preview your actual component, your actual view. But you might also want to see it next time you open the layout editor. You want to preview all your custom view without having to run on emulator or device and compile everything. So it's you're going to gain some time. So it won't render if you are using in your custom view any dynamic data, or if you are relying on the activity lifecycle, or if you depend on some services. So I'm not saying that you shouldn't do that in your view, although that you might want to separate the different concepts. But you can provide some helper for the layout editor to have some other branching and find the right value for your to preview your layout. So for the example, we're just gonna go through creating this small SIG-bar. So to start with, we just provide a simple placeholder view right now with a background, and we're gonna come back to it later. But at least we know where it's gonna be, and we have some time. We can still preview our layout without our custom view. So to start our custom view, we'll just define a setter and a getter, and it's just simple. But what you might do with this setter and getter is using it in your onCreate method. Right. So here we are setting the tracker tint and position tracker tint within the onCreate, which will lead to, again, I like gray today, like this ugly gray SIG-bar. So what you can do instead of setting the colors in the onCreate method, what you can do is create your stylable attributes. And then you can provide those colors within XML. So here we define the player widget tracker tint and player widget position tracker tint attributes. And then in your XML, you can pass the right color. So don't rely on lifecycle and allow setup within XML. and create some nice default for your views. And when I say default, that's what I was saying before, provide a way for the layout editor to branch out of the call to your services or other thing that might not be called within the layout editor. So here, for example, we have our playtime method that is in our view, and this delegates to the player service. And the player service doesn't exist in the context of the layout editor, so we'll end up with a null pointer exception. So what you should do instead is use the isInEdit method, which is provided like since, I guess, API 1, and provide a static string for that. So in that case, when you're going to run your layout, playtime will return 2 on the layout editor, and on the emulator or on the device, it will call the right service. So what I was saying, don't rely on services, and don't rely on a network and database. If you do, just provide defaults. So here we had our placeholder that we had before. And what you can do with this placeholder, now that we have our custom view with defaults, you can use a convert view option on the right-click menu and use this dialog to either select one of the provided view or use auto-completion to find the view you just added. And if we do that, now we have the right view. And the nice thing with convert view is we're going to strip out any attribute that is not that becomes obsolete when you converted your view. So for example, if you had, I don't know, a progress bar before and you're converting to an image view, I don't know, maybe it's a bad example, but you will be able, the layout editor will remove all progress bar attributes. So if you had like the progress attribute, it will be stripped out. So once again, that's what we were saying before. We are not leaving any useless attributes when creating layouts. And then we can just remove the background from our placeholder, and we have our custom view that is rendering in our layout editor. And then, so the last section of this talk is device configuration toolbar that Jerome is going to finish to present.
Yes, so very briefly, the last thing I wanted to mention is the device configuration toolbar, and by that I mean this thing at the top of your layout editor. And that allows you to do various things like switching from landscape to portrait, changing the device API level, a couple of things that you would usually come from your device. Two things I want to mention very briefly. There's a custom option in the device menu that allows you to drag and see how your layout just reacts in different sizes. You can see here that like the chain behaves as you would expect by expanding when you expand your layout. It's also very useful if you have like a smaller layout, for example, for smaller sizes. Here I removed buttons when it's too small, and you can see that if I go too small, there are only 3 buttons. If I go larger, 5 buttons again. Finally, if you attended the previous talk and you like to do some theming, here I created 3 different styles. One that is like black on white, the other white on black, one that has no action bar. And if I use the theme attributes for the color button, I can simply switch theme in the layout editor and see how it renders in the different theme. And I will leave you with Vadim to sum it up.
So we don't have a lot of time, so I'm going to sum it up quickly. Constraint layout and layout editor goes hand in hand. We are building it. It's the same team building the 2 of them. So it's really, layout editor is really the tool to use for constraint layout. And constraint layout is quite verbose, so you want to use the layout editor to improve your productivity when using it. You want to use design time attribute and sample data to go back to your layout and preview them without having to run on device. It's a powerful tool. Use it. I love sample data, honestly. Then we went to creating custom view, provide nice default, and it's a great way, all of that is a great way to preview your layout without having to run any emulator or device. So right after, stay tuned, Nicolas and John are going to talk about constraint layout 2.0, and you will be able to ask them questions because we don't have time here. And tomorrow, Eric is going to do a workshop about constraint layout. It's going to be great, so go there so you can go through this feature, and he's going to provide some nice tips on constraint layout. And finally, there is I/O talk I guess it's in 2 weeks, even maybe less. You can live stream it, and we're going to talk about some new thing in the layout editor and constraint layout, so stay tuned. And so hopefully, those of you who prefer writing the layout by hand, now you will be using the layout editor as a handy tool to improve your productivity. Thank you very much, and see you to the next talk.